Good morning. Welcome to the Critical Information Conference. The title of this panel is Artwork Network. And my name is Alexandra Nicolaides. I'm the student respondent, and this is Ralske, who's the faculty respondent. Kurt, did you want to say a few words?
I did. I thought it would just set up the relationship between the title of this panel to what we're likely to be talking about. I like the title. I feel it's a little broad. Based on, we were originally supposed to have four panelists, but, well, not four panelists, but four papers to talk about. We have only three. And I just wanted to comment before we started that I noticed perhaps one similarity between these three papers that perhaps narrows our focus a bit. When I think of the word network, I think of, well, I think of the internet, or I think of all systems of exchange, distribution, and control. I think that these three projects share something in that they're focused on what happens when artworks work within existing systems or in relation to existing systems while accepting the terms of those systems rather than coming at the project from purely a critical or radical stance. And I think that this maybe gives us one way to tie together these three very interesting works. So, having said that, let's continue.
So, John Tyson is going to present a paper on the Afterlives of Systems Aesthetics. Systems Aesthetics was a essay written by Jack Burnham in 1968. It was published in Art Forum, and John is going to be looking about what's next for that particular essay. It had a resurgence recently. And then I'm just going to also introduce our other panelists. This is Elizabeth Hawley, and she'll be presenting third, actually, on WochenKlausur, and their Art and Activism. They're a collective group started in 1993 who works within art institutions and tries to affect political change. And Amanda Sepanski and Jonathan Frey are going to be are graphic designers at Pratt, and they have a very interesting project, well, two different projects using the fence of Pratt between the campus and Clinton Hill as a site of sort of investigation of transformation design. Yes.
The Afterlives of Systems Aesthetics. A translation issues from the original, not so much from its life as from its afterlife. No translation would be possible if, in its ultimate essence, it strove for likeness to the original. For in its afterlife, which could not be called that if it were not a transformation and a renewal of something living, the original undergoes a change. Today I propose that translations of a temporal and spatial variety might operate with a similar logic to the linguistic shifts Walter Benjamin describes. So, what was systems aesthetics? In September 1968, Jack Burnham's Systems Aesthetics was published in Art Forum 7. The essay was one of a variety of texts the artist and critic would pen on the subject of art as system. Burnham proposed that a Kuhnian paradigm shift had occurred in Western society. No longer were human beings homo faber, creators of things, tools and images, he tells us, but instead we had become homo arbiter formae, the makers of aesthetic decisions. The shift Burnham describes sounds like it maps onto a transition from industrial production to post-Fordism. However, rather than serving to reproduce the logic of late capitalism in the gallery, the critic called upon artists to, quote, assume a new, more critical function, quote, and do more than act merely as managers of their audiences. Burnham championed artists like his friends and interlocutors Hans Haacke and Les Levine, in addition to Robert Morris, Dan Flavin, Alan Capraw, and Meryl Lederman-Kellys. He as well held up the Gutai Group, Otto Pina of Group Zero, and Robert Breer as important early precedents for systems aesthetics. In line with the oeuvres of the aforementioned creators, systems aesthetics came via the production of works that were conceived as couplings between the user-viewers as well as their surroundings. Though they often rely on the marriage of art and technology, employing new modern materials, artworks with a systems aesthetic are not necessarily forms that technologically determine spectatorship. Instead, Burnham suggests that artworks should be viewed primarily as a mode of communication, both affecting beholders and affected by them. The critic held, "What people do better than computers so far is to evaluate situations or entities which have significant qualitative differences. Traditionally, we have called this aesthetics and also politics." Unquote. Hence, also echoing Benjamin, Burnham's systems aesthetics is as well systems politics, a way of fighting the system and questioning the status quo. Burnham's ideas were central to many of the new forms of art that emerged in the 1960s, such as earthworks, kinetic art, conceptual art, tech art, minimalism. In his 1968 essay, Burnham locates his critical platform in opposition to more conservative voices like that of Michael Fried, affirming that theatricality and literalism, terms that Fried used to censure minimal art, might actually be better understood as systems aesthetics. Moreover, indicative of Burnham's centrality for conceptualism, his thoughts on systems are brought up repeatedly in the interviews with major artists conducted by Patricia Norvell in recording conceptual art. Avant-garde impresario Willoughby Sharp channeled many of Burnham's notions in such exhibitions as luminism, kineticism, system sculpture in environmental situations, air art, and earth art. Perhaps coming as a surprise to us today, there's even an essay on earth systems in the catalog for the Cornell-based show. Additionally, in a 1969 video performance, East Coast, West Coast, Nancy Holt's East Coast artist persona poses questions to her West Coast counterpart, interpreted by Robert Smithson, which points straight to Burnham. Has he read systems theory? Structuralist anthropology? Indeed, the critic was also one of the first to use semiotics and other structuralist theories to interpret works of art. Long before Rosalind Krauss was plotting art history on Klein groups, Burnham had already diagrammed the structure of art. The supposed failure of Burnham's software at the Jewish Museum in 1970 to 71 marked the beginning of his downfall. While the critic continued to write and curate exhibitions during the later 1970s and 80s, he further alienated himself from many in the art world by his argumentative character, his zealous pursuit of Kabbalistic readings of art, and his eventual rejection of tech art, which he dubbed in 1980, quote, "the panacea that failed." A brief meteor, to cite Caroline Jones. Burnham's star had evidently faded like the works he deemed outmoded. Afterlives of systems aesthetics. During the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the proper name Jack Burnham started to re-emerge. Art historians Margot Vizuet and Edward Shankin were some of the first to begin to resuscitate Burnham's ideas. For an older generation of scholars like Krauss or Benjamin Buchloh, an apparently utopian celebration of technology and art was to be viewed with the highest degree of skepticism. For a younger generation, most of whom had grown up constantly interfacing with personal computers and connected to the World Wide Web, the notion of coupling art and technology surely seems more provocative than anathema, the historical distance enabling more critical consumption without the need for outright rejection. Michel Kuo, a critic and Harvard PhD candidate working on the Kluver and Rauschenberg-led outfit Experiments in Art and Technology, or EAT, is perhaps the most important example of a new wave of scholars, primarily because of her high-profile position as editor-in-chief at Artforum. The magazine and its associated websites are major arbitrators of taste. Since taking the helm, Kuo has increasingly directed the focus of Artforum backward and inwards to the tech art of the 1960s and 70s that had been avoided by many in the Anglo-American art world. Kuo's own article, The Uncertainty of Objects and Ideas, Recent Sculpture, of February 2007, saw only the second invocation of Burnham on the pages of Artforum since 1988, when Thomas Machiavelli interviewed the systems art critic. In the past 3 years, Burnham has been mentioned in 10 articles. There's been a real increase. Specific engagements and reassessments of Burnham's contributions to the history of art in Artforum come in Anne Wagner's discussion of his notorious software exhibit, Data Almanac, or Caroline Jones's System Symptoms, both in a 50th anniversary issue on Art's New Media, which of course are hardly still new. These texts and others serve to publicize the notions the critic explored on the pages of the very same journal. allowing them to have currency once again. And indeed, a hyperlink to Burnham's Systems Aesthetics accompanies Jones's article on artforum.com. Presently broken, it nonetheless bespeaks a renewed circulation within the virtual frame of the magazine. The return of systems aesthetics is not solely a hypertextual phenomenon or a textual phenomenon. The afterlife has also very much occurred within art institutions, and I'll briefly mention a few examples. Daniel Birnbaum's 2009 Venice Biennale, Making Worlds, the Guggenheim's 2013 Gutai Splendid Playground, which showcased the group's work with new technologies. Pina's Light Ballet was shown at MIT's List Visual Arts Center in 2011, concurrent with a refabrication in its entirety of Hans Hacke's 1967 self-titled show. Curated by Caroline Jones, we should consider this restaging of systems aesthetics in relation to the replication of Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades in the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you also for having us at the conference. Thank you for everyone for coming today. Just to reintroduce ourselves, my name is Jonathan Frey. This is Amanda Sepanski. We're both MFA students in the graduate in the graphic design or the communication design program at the Pratt Institute. And today we're going to be presenting on two projects from our transformation design class. And so they're different projects. I did one, Amanda did one. Amanda's with Good Fences Makes Good Neighbors, which she did in collaboration with her partner Joseph Coulier, and mine was the Pratt Free Library, which I did with my partner Greg Riestenberg.
So the class, again, that we did these projects for is called Transformation Design. And basically what transformation design is, it means like the application of the design process to create changes in behavior and form. So in the class, we do a lot of work with different communities and try and incorporate participation from the communities to influence not only the design process, but also the final outcome.
And the Pratt Institute also has this initiative, and that particular year it's called the Inclusion Illusion Inclusion Initiative. And so the overall goal was very similar to what we were trying to do in the class, and so we kind of correlated our work a little bit with the institution. And the overall point of this initiative was to encourage the student and the faculty to go beyond the borders of the Pratt community, and through art and through creative ways to kind of find connection points and find ways to engage the community that surrounds Pratt.
So to start off with the project prompt, my partner Joseph and I identified something about the campus that was of equal interest to both of us, and that's the physical fence that surrounds the campus, creating this physical and metaphorical barrier between Pratt Institute and the surrounding neighborhood. And Pratt Institute, the main campus, is located in Brooklyn in the neighborhood of Clinton Hill, and it's completely surrounded by this fence. This is a picture of one of the main entrances, and you can see the security guard sitting there on the left. And during normal daytime hours, the campus is actually a public space, and anyone has access. They're free to come and go and use the space as a public area, not just students and Pratt community members. And so in light of trying to get the community members to actively participate in our process, Joseph and I adopted IDEO's human-centered design toolkit. So the first step of our research was to go out and actually interview the members of both communities. And so we interviewed people in the Clinton Hill community as well as people in the Pratt community, just on their general feelings about the fence. And we thought maybe we would find a collective voice from the Pratt students and a collective voice from the Clinton Hill community. But what we really found is that everyone had their own opinions about the fence in different contexts, and there wasn't really a collective voice from each side. But people were very interested in the conversation as a whole and the topic. And this is an example of two different Pratt students and how they felt differently. One felt that she was completely isolated from the outside community, and another felt that the fence made no difference and there was no isolation at all. The communities were one and the same. So what we wanted to do was take this conversation and turn it into a public conversation, given that people were so interested already in the topic. And we drew some inspiration from Candy Chang, who's an artist from New Orleans, and she does a lot of public installations and using public spaces for participation. And this is an installation that she did originally in New Orleans that's asking people, what do you want to do before you die? And the idea is that you walk up to the chalkboard and you write something on it, And when you walk away, your idea is still up there for people who come after you to see. So you don't have to be present any longer to be involved in the conversation and for people to see what your message was. And then we also drew some inspiration from a Robert Frost poem where he states that good fences make good neighbors. And since we're questioning this and not saying that it's true, we turned it into a question. And we wanted to install these letters somewhere on campus, and what better place to install the letters than on the actual fence itself. So we cut out the letters and we started experimenting with ways to adhere them to the fence just on the outside of campus. And we wanted them to stand out in the environment that we're placing them in. So we painted them this really bright pink color so that you couldn't miss it when you're walking by. And we chose a spot on the fence to install the letters. You can see the security guard again up in the left-hand corner. So this is the same entrance I showed earlier, but right on the outside of the gate in Clinton Hill rather than on the inside on the Pratt side. And we adhered all of the letters to the fence. And we wanted to, just as Candy Chang did, leave a way for the participants involved in the conversation to leave their feedback in a written way, as well as verbal. So we adhered, you can see a white sheet of paper that scrolls from the top of the post all the way across the sidewalk. So when you're walking by, you have to step over it or in order to get by, so you can't just walk by without noticing it. And this is an example actually of one Pratt student talking to a Clinton Hill community member. So this is already incorporating one side into the other, which was our original goal. And this was the sheet of paper. This woman was writing her response after she was finished speaking with the Pratt student for other people to read after she walked away. And this is the sheet halfway through the day. I would say it was up for about 6 or 7 hours. And you can see there are a lot of different responses. Some are serious, some aren't serious. And the interesting thing is that people were talking about not only this fence, but raising questions about fences and talking about fences in other contexts and different cultural implications. And so this is the end of the day. That's my partner, Joseph. The interesting thing is that as we were setting it up and taking it down, people were coming up to us and asking us what we were doing and talking about the fence. And this guy actually lives in Clinton Hill, and he was walking by through the campus with his nephew. And it was interesting to see a community member that does take advantage of the fact that it's an open campus and they use the space as a public space.
Right. I'm Elizabeth Hawley. I'm a graduate student in the art history department at the CUNY Graduate Center, and the working title of this paper is Art, Activism, and Media Manipulation, WochenKlausur's Social Interventions. Since 1993, the activist art group WochenKlausur, which loosely means Weeks of Enclosure, has staged socio-political interventions using the infrastructure and financial means of various cultural institutions to enact productive, problem-solving measures where they see fit in the society surrounding the institutions. WochenKlausur's own involvement is transient, generally between 3 and 12 weeks, approximately, but their intention is to stimulate longer-lasting initiatives sustained by the communities themselves. By performatively drawing attention to a problem, they create a media focus on issues that are often left unaddressed by mainstream outlets. The production of these projects, the frameworks surrounding them, and the results they attain point to the changing conception of art when paired with activism. This paper is an attempt to situate such works amidst the questions surrounding the autonomy of art, the contemporary concept of democracy, the necessity of art institutions, the media and legal institutions in the production of activist art, and the changing terms of reception and critique regarding socially engaged art. And I should note these are not great images, especially for an art history paper. They're taken from a book published by WochenKlausur or from the WochenKlausur website. So just that brief caveat. The group was formed in 1992 when artist Wolfgang Zingel was invited to produce a work in Vienna. He solicited 8 artists to assist him in researching the history of the city in order to locate a social problem that the group could address. Within the typical time span of an exhibition, the group undertook the research, selected a problem to address, and went about securing the means necessary to make a concrete, long-term intervention. The issue they chose to tackle concerned the lack of guaranteed medical care for the homeless people of Vienna. The research had uncovered the inefficient bureaucratic procedure homeless members of society were expected to maneuver in order to gain access to health care. WochenKlausur devised an intervention titled Intervention to Provide Health Care to Homeless People to bring the care directly to the homeless. Their plan was to hire a doctor to travel in a medically equipped bus, which you see here. And this bus would make regular stops in the areas of the city frequented by the homeless. The purchase of this mobile clinic was quickly made possible by donations from sponsors, and a social welfare agency agreed to ensure the permanent operation of the bus, as long as doing so would not entail additional costs for their agency. To guarantee this, WochenKlausur developed a plan in which the doctor's salary would be paid by the city. However, the city councilor for social welfare, while enthusiastic about the project, was hesitant to include this salary in the city budget. With time running out and that the exhibition was quickly drawing to a close, the group had to strategize. And in the end, it was a so-called media trick that forced the councilor's hand. The group had been in touch with a correspondent from the magazine Der Spiegel throughout their project, in the hopes that he would write an article on the intervention. He never did, but he nonetheless agreed to do WochenKlausur a favor. In a meeting with the counselor, he pretended that such an article was indeed in the works, and asked her point blank whether she would approve the funding of the doctor's salary, leading to her reluctant agreement. This manipulation via the media aligns WochenKlausur's methods with those of contemporary tactical media practitioners, who subvert and intervene in mainstream media outlets not just to jam culture, but to change it. Rather than hijacking a radio station, WochenKlausur ensured that radio discussions around the project produced sentences like, quote, "Now it's up to the city whether the bus providing health care to the homeless will be carrying a doctor," end quote. City officials, fearing negative publicity, agreed to fund the doctor, and a bus, christened Louise, has been in operation ever since. The practical success of WochenKlausur's first project has led to 37 subsequent interventions, and the members of the group were always in flux. Zingel, the unofficial founder, has characterized their decision-making process in terms of consensus, and this indeed characterized their first intervention. Later interventions, however, are often better characterized in terms of agonism, which Chantal Mouffe positions counter to consensus. Agonism facilitates interactions between individuals with opposing viewpoints without the expectation of compromise or consensus. Two projects in particular demonstrate this tendency in WochenKlausur's work, the first being their intervention to aid drug-addicted women. 9 artists researched recent drug policies in Zurich and came to the conclusion that drug-addicted women who turn to prostitution to fund their habit are in a uniquely precarious situation, at risk of sexual violence, homelessness, and the dual societal stigma of being prostitutes and drug users. WochenKlausur realized that a pressing problem for these women was the lack of an effective shelter. Homeless shelters' operating hours are often restricted to the night, which is, of course, when prostitutes attract the majority of their clients. So the group devised a plan to buy a former hotel, and this is an image of that former hotel, renovate it, and provide daytime staffing for a women's-only facility. When funding efforts fell short, the group turned to an unusual plan. They rented a boat, invited carefully chosen passengers aboard, explained their project, and then sent the passengers out onto Lake Zurich to discuss the plight of the women. The conversation served the dual purpose of rendering the cause visible, while providing a neutral space where individuals could perhaps speak in a less guarded manner than is generally the case in the public realm. While the former facilitated the generation of media interest, the latter too was crucial, as most of the participants were politicians, journalists, and legal or medical specialists, which is to say people who have a significant investment in protecting their reputations. The public dialogue around drug addicts was particularly fraught at the time. Convincing public figures to address the issue was thus quite a feat, although it was not done without some of the same trickery that had characterized their intervention in Vienna. In order to secure the participation of two prominent politicians, the mayor of Zurich and the national secretary, WochenKlausur told the mayor that the national secretary had agreed to participate, but only if the mayor be part of the conversation. The flattered mayor agreed, at which point they reversed their request in a call to the national secretary, telling him the mayor had agreed to be a passenger on the boat if the national secretary be one as well. WochenKlausur used a similar tactic to procure the participation of two well-known Swiss newspaper editors. And as Zingel noted, after discovering the participation of these prominent figures, quote, other parties scented the threat of media coverage and did not want to risk missing the boat, end quote.
So now we're going to have a question and discussion time. So
I would actually just like to jump in for 1 minute and perhaps summarize or give a focus to our discussion. Perhaps I could draw some connections between these papers and also slight differences. John, I would say you're inquiring into John Burnham. You're operating. You're interested in activist art, but you're kind of interested in the trajectory of Burnham's work and how critically his star has risen and fallen and risen again. But you're more interested in what's occurring within art criticism more than actual social practice.
Yeah, I've been quite curious about how Burnham seems to have been taken up by various types of institutions. So I think that's right.
Okay, great. So I'm going to separate you and Elizabeth and Amanda and Jonathan. I would say that your focus is art actions that are specifically working within existing systems and essentially operating by their rules. For example, Elizabeth, in talking about WochenKlausur, pretty much everything that occurs is happening without direct interaction with the people who are actually suffering from whatever social conditions that led to this artwork occurring. For example, it's dialogues between administrators or kind of intra-governmental exchanges. You have an art institution supported by the government which enables a discussion between people with legal training and government officials so I'm suggesting that this is rather than coming at social practice from a critical perspective, it's working within an existing system according to its rules. And similarly, Jonathan and Amanda, that you're making, you're opening a space for dialogue or to allow an exchange that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. But apart from allowing an opportunity for discussion, you didn't change the existence of the fence. You didn't tear it down. You didn't and you were able to change the way people thought about the fence, which is important. Yet you didn't fundamentally change the rules that are in place. So rather than and I'm not making these as negative comments. I'm just sort of trying to make an observation about similarities between these very interesting papers. We can also use this as an occasion to talk about. For me, what's interesting is that these works critique the autonomy of art as autonomous space where what occurs only makes sense within its own sphere. So you could think of it as what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. This tradition that art really only makes sense when it's separate.
Well, just to also interject, though, that Jonathan and Amanda are working from a design standpoint.
Okay, that's actually very important. Design was described to me by a designer once. the difference between design and art is that design is working on problems that are given to you, whereas art works on self-created problems that the artist defines their own problems and attempts to solve them. And this is one way of highlighting the difference between autonomous work and work that's dependent on actual conditions existing or existing systems. So the artist, in creating his own problems, is kind of declaring his or her autonomy, whereas the designer, in approaching or beginning with existing problems, is starting from a connection to other spheres. Now, my general question though is, in making this connection with existing spheres, what strategies are possible and what strategies are most beneficial? Beneficial in terms of either making the most interesting work of art, or B, having a specific objectively beneficial outcome in social terms. So, right. Let's begin a conversation here. Elizabeth, what do you say about my critique? Not critique. You mentioned it yourself that this is almost art as lobbyist activity. That it's modest contributions and small-scale interventions.
Well, two things. It perhaps is not so clear in this particular paper, but they do. You kind of can divide WochenKlausur's interventions into two groups. One group being the kind of lobbyist, as you describe it, kind of activity, and the other group being interventions where they do solicit the participation of the people who, I think, as you put it, sort of are suffering from the system in which they are working, but also sort of trying to change. So in some cases they do have the participation of those people. But the small scale aspect of their project, I think, is also, it's related to a larger issue that I think a lot of so-called activist artists grapple with, and that's, is it better to produce a work of art that produces sort of real, so to speak, real change, concrete change, lasting change? I think duration is how these works are usually described. They have a duration. Or is it also effective to produce a work that is symbolic, that is perhaps can change the consciousness of people who see it or participate in it, or what have you. I think Zingel, who the sort of unofficial founder of WochenKlausur, he basically describes the success or failure of the works of WochenKlausur's interventions in terms of whether or not they succeed in their intention, right? If they succeed in actually producing lasting social change. If WochenKlausur leaves and the surrounding society, the surrounding community continues this intervention. That's how he defines success. I think that's problematic if you're terming your practice an art practice, because it completely takes the art out of the work. You can't judge it. You can't give it a value based on its art status.
Yes.
So I think, and it's a major.
Yeah,
tension.
absolutely. If you go back into aesthetic philosophy, Kant said that art can be beautiful because it's not functional. That as soon as it becomes functional, its utility makes it good, but it precludes aesthetic experience. So if the artist is saying, well, no, the actual success of this work is that we have this quantifiable, good, beneficial social result, maybe he's shutting down the possibility of someone else's aesthetic experience.
Right, and I also think that some of their most interesting projects have failed in Zingel's terms. The intervention to aid drug-addicted women, where they send out people on a boat onto Lake Zurich, which I think is fascinating, just as kind of a performance of sorts, that failed. They did not achieve long-term funding, and yet I'm not sure that it failed as a work of art. Yeah.
Maybe we can bring in John to talk about the term aesthetics and how Burnham saw the aesthetics of systems versus
Right.
the
I mean,
more
I think for
traditional
Burnham,
functional
he's,
aesthetics.
totally rejecting the Kantian paradigm, and in particular, seeing it linked to an older, kind of Greenbergian-inflected critical platform. And so for Burnham, there's utility and aesthetics are not mutually exclusive terms. That I think that what's emerging with a number of the works that we've seen, that maybe there's a possibility for aesthetics and functionality to coexist.
And maybe if you can talk a little bit about, Kurt mentioned the differences between design and art, and I just wanted to know if that's something that you agree with, or that there's actually what the goals are of design versus art, because in some ways I think your project actually really, it does fit into this idea of what's happening in art today. And you mentioned last night about social design and going into the ideas of social design, and I wanted to, maybe we can just pull that apart a little bit about why we're still distinguishing design and art.
I think in the case of both of our projects, but my project, I would consider it a design piece based on, in the way that he defined also design, is that it was an existing problem and that the fence was already there. It's an existing system. But we wouldn't have arrived at the solution that we came to if it wasn't for immersing ourselves in the community and dissecting the problem and and the final outcome had to be something that functioned on an objective level. But to that extent, I don't think there's really an objective solution on a larger scale. An objective solution to this degree can only exist for like smaller communities. There's no universal way to create this conversation necessarily. I'm not sure because we haven't applied it to other situations, but I'm not sure if this is answering your question. But I think it was a design solution, and I think the line between design and art here as far as these installations is sort of a blurred one.
Yeah, kind of go off that. I think I kind of like the idea of the small scale solution, because with what we're doing, like each solution has to be specific to that community and to that context. And so there probably is ways to universalize it and take what the model we set up and apply it to the next. But I think it becomes hard to create these universal solutions too. They're just as fraught with problems, I guess. And also I'm thinking about the idea of aesthetics versus utility. Like I kind of liked that we were able to kind of evaluate the successes or failures of our project based, like, not so much in the terms of art and aesthetics, but based on like how did it function.
Mm-hmm.
Because the first version or the first iteration of my library, it wasn't as aestheticized, but it still functioned better than we thought it would. Where the second time it had been aestheticized, but now it didn't function at all because the context had changed. So I found that relationship interesting.
Why don't we open it up to a question?
I was just continuing this line. I was thinking between the relationship of art design and social function, and also urban planning. Like your projects both made me think of Jane Jacobs and how we navigate our cities and our spaces. And she hated Lincoln Center, which doesn't have a physical fence, but which people don't really, it's an enormous block that people usually walk around unless you're going to these high-priced, Met tickets or whatever. But I thought it was interesting how you sort of made the fence sort of like a permeable membrane to have people stick in. I mean, just having them pause to question the border that you can see through, and you can walk through technically, but perhaps people just aren't used to it, so they don't do it. I didn't have a question, I'm sorry. I actually wondered though, had you thought about Jane Jacobs at all, or that was not even?
I'm not familiar with
okay.
it. But I think it has a lot to do with how we navigate space and how these structures kind of impede or prohibit us to to move and how that influences the social interaction within a space.
Right, it's not as, it didn't actually make the barrier more permeable, but it changed the whole nature of the fence itself. Actually, people were stopping there. I mean, they couldn't go through, they were still a security guard, but suddenly a fence became an actual sort of like moment of pause, or an object which actually has a programmatic sort of focus.
You'd mentioned strategies before, and I think that like making something into a spectacle or something that just gets attention and gravitates people towards it is a good way of at least starting a conversation or an intervention.
Absolutely.
Right, and since we were fitting it into the existing system of the fence, we couldn't reasonably, physically tear down the fence, but we had it within our power to shift people's perception of the fence,
Absolutely.
even if it was just for a little while.
Were there any comments on your scroll that were particularly noticeable that's in terms of, because I remember you said something about other relationships to other fences or to other moments in people's
Yeah,
lives?
well, it was interesting to see the differences in what people were saying. A lot of people were questioning, like metaphorically, what a fence means, and then one guy wrote a really long paragraph about how he grew up in Brooklyn and everything is fenced into something, and I think he was somewhere in his 50s or 60s, and he said this is the first time in my life, I've been in Brooklyn for 60 some years, this is the first time in my life that somebody has questioned a fence to me, because everything in Brooklyn is fenced into something, which I thought was interesting.
I just want to throw out another idea that perhaps critiques some of the strategies here. Again, I'm not trying to discount anybody's work, but it's an interesting idea. Jacques Rancière in his Emancipated Spectator talks about this idea that the idea of specialized knowledge can be problematic. That when an artist or an activist begins work from the position that they have specialized knowledge or skills or abilities that their audience lacks, then the exchange is a little bit skewed. It kind of shuts down the possibility of dialogue. Instead, there's only a possibility of potentially patronizing exchange, or perhaps it provides cover for almost a colonial sort of relationship to be set up. So, and what Rancière proposes is that a sort of more even meaning of dialogue on some sort of level playing field that's more radical than some kind of potentially patronizing improvement campaign. Now, I'm certainly not going to argue that these things didn't do social good. I'm not saying I agree with Rancière's idea, but I'm wondering if you have a response to this perspective.
Yes, I think it's one of the few scholars who's addressed WochenKlausur quite extensively criticizes the group in terms of sort of participatory art. She criticizes them in that even in works that are more participatory perhaps than the ones that I have shown today, they have so many interventions, I couldn't go over them all. Even in those works, there's still the authority of the artists is still very much there, and even if there is some degree of participation, they're the ones who make the ultimate decisions, and they are also the ones who do the sort of write-up of the intervention. They're the ones that dictate the narrative, and she finds this problematic, right, because of that same sort of the skewed nature of the projects. I don't know. I'm not sure that you can ever escape the artist, even the activist artist, being the author, right? I mean, that's I know the death of the author has been around for a while, but I think it would be very hard to create a practice in which there isn't a bit of a hierarchy.
I think another problem with Rancière, it seems to me that on one level it's a kind of naive disavowal of the fact that there are always kind of power differentials and different competences within any kind of interaction. And part B, isn't he doing precisely what he's critiquing by doing the reveal to us and showing us, oh, how flawed and patronizing we've been in our interactions? And while I think his point should be well taken, that they can make one, in the same value, that kind of making things visible, as we've seen in lots of these practices, has kind of potential to denaturalize them and maybe reprogram or bring up a kind of critical reassessment. I don't think we should discount specialized competence, and that's like precisely why all of us are here, right? That we've developed a particular competence and we have a certain amount of authority, not an absolute authority, but some kind of authority to talk about what we've spoken about, and maybe bring everyone else along in a process of learning with us. And I think that this kind of pedagogy against Rancière is maybe one of the values of all these types of works. And so while he brings interesting questions in relation to these works, I don't think what he's proposing is absolutely utopian. And I think it's almost impossible to actually play out. Even his prime example, teaching language, right? It's not specialized knowledge. He's teaching, it's codes that the ignorant schoolmaster facilitates for his students, rather than particular knowledge. It's a kind of knowledge, but I think it's very difficult to actually transmit facts through a Rancièrean model.
I agree. I don't see who you put Rancière in practice really, but I do think this idea that a conversation that's undirected, a conversation that's brought into existence that isn't under control, maybe possibly something that occurs on the boat and on Lake Zurich, it is a really interesting possibility. But I would say most social practice or activist art projects sometimes come in with the terms of the conversation predetermined. I'm thinking of a counterexample of a kind of obscure German video art piece by Christian Jankowski in 2001. He did this piece called The Holy Artwork, where he went to a Texan religious TV show that occurred every Sunday in Texas. And there was basically, a televangelist doing his thing there every Sunday morning on cable TV. And Christian Jankowski just inserted himself. He went to the show with the permission. He just laid down on the stage for the duration of the program. And what occurred was that the pastor had to explain the artist's presence, and kind of the television pastor knew that this work was going to be a work of art and use it as an opportunity to have a conversation between this world of art and this world of tele-evangelism, which never intersect. It was not a directed conversation, it was more of a collision. I'm suggesting that maybe this undirected collision can make for, well, maybe makes for better art than a collision where the terms are, or not a collision, but an exchange where the terms are predetermined by the authors.
Even with the collision that occurred with the library, that somehow, whatever that young lady's name, the English major, who kind of became a librarian, a sort of authority in the library, even though she, I think that even with some structure, it's possible for these kind of poetic collisions to occur as your new information kind of collides with you. So, even something with quite a lot of structure, I think there's a potential for these types of not totally programmed things or explorations to play out.
In the case of WochenKlausur, though, they become very hard to document because, as I mentioned, on the boat and in the pavilions, there's no recording device. There's no one there taking down what's being said. Privacy is paramount in those projects. So we know these conversations happened, but we don't know, we don't know exactly the trajectory of them. So I think that's an interesting aspect as well.
Do people know not to trust WochenKlausur? Like the idea of this is sort of bad faith manipulation? Are people become skeptical of the information that they spread, or is that something that maybe only an art historian like Grant Kester can tell us about?
I think it's more a debate within art history.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think
most people don't know about these
communities
tricks.
where they're doing this. I don't think that people are suspicious of them on that account.
Okay.
Are there other opinions about it?
Please go.
Yeah, I've got a question for Elizabeth, please. About the artworks or social interventions you've described. I've actually got two questions, but they kind of intertwined. The first one is, what exactly is the artwork there? Is it the pavilion? Is it, for example, is it the situation created? Is it the conversation? Which aspect of it is the artwork that we're discussing here? And then the second one, how does this artwork participate in the contemporary art world? As in reproduction? Because it's not being recorded, but it is, how is it being photographed and by who and where is it reproduced? And then art market, how does it participate there? And then art criticism, how is it being covered and how is it being referred to?
Okay, I'll try to answer these in order. All of it, short answer, all of it is the artwork. But they have been criticized as not being art, both by a sort of general audience as well as by art critics who just say this. It veers too far into activism to be art. I think there is still a lot of pushback against activist art practices that are more activist in a certain way than they are art, which is, I think, what sort of led you to question this. Art, well, and I guess that answers your question about art criticism as well. And what was the third one? I've already forgotten.
Art market.
The market, yes. Well, they're not a particularly profitable group, as I think a lot of activist artists who work in this way are not. They basically, they get their funding from cultural institutions, usually art museums, usually European art museums, invite them to come in and they give them sort of funding to create an intervention in the society around whatever institution it is. So that's how they get their money to enact the intervention, but there's certainly not a profit being made. I don't think their work is particularly marketable. I'm sure it could be if people had an interest in it. Exactly, the market can always co-opt things. But the way it's recorded, it's essentially just via photographs that I believe the members take themselves. And they're not particularly, I mean, as you saw, the photographs are not particularly aestheticized, right? They're not particularly, they're not particularly aestheticized. They're sort of documentary, which is a problematic term in and of itself, but they are, for the most part, documentary photos, and that's how they record their works. And they have a website where they do a sort of write-up on each work of art. At one point, they published a book of those, essentially of those write-ups up until a certain year. They've progressed since then, but yeah, that's how their work exists for the most part.
Do we have time for one last question? Any other perspectives?
Might I just add a comment in relationship to your description of this project, and also all kinds of participatory, relational, or activist works that might be at first sight seen as exempt from reification and commodification.
I don't think they're exempt from it. I just don't think they've been commodified at this point. Let me just. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
What I would remind is of convergence with Burnham's thesis of this networked and relational discursive practice that is concomitant or connative with post-Fordist or post-industrial so-called economies that prize not production of goods or objects, but services and immaterial symbolic capital and relations that are not tangible material objects, but rather are reified or articulated in terms that also cover social relations. So if if those practices that have emerged since maybe late 80s, right? They have done so only insofar as they've been allowed to by the change in labor structure and the infrastructure of what usually is called market economy.
Thank you.
No, I mean that's precisely the analytic interest in why we call it contemporary.
Right. Oh, I mean, I agree, and I think that's why this kind of practice really proliferated in the 90s, right? And yeah.
And I'd say only up until recently have we commodified our activism. So people like Pussy Riot and so forth, Zizek, these are people who sort of now stand up for those early 90s sort of liberal ideologies.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Before we end, I would just like to, I think we should give a big thank you to Russ for organizing this entire time. So, Russ!